In this Aetherdrift draft guide, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into the format. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons for each color. I will provide archetype overviews, show off some combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are vehicles, mounts, cycling, start your engines, and exhaust. Vehicles is a fairly straightforward mechanic where a vehicle card is an artifact, but it can become a creature if you crew it. In order to crew a vehicle, you tap any number of creatures you control with total power equal to the crew cost or more. So in the case of Spot Cycle Scouter, that number is 1, and then the vehicle becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. Mounts are like vehicles, but they are creatures in their default state instead of artifacts. So Autarch Mammoth is going to be a 5/5 whether or not it is saddled, but if you do saddle it, you tap any number of other creatures you control with total power equal to its saddle cost, in this case 5 or more, and then the mount becomes saddled until end of turn, and then you can only saddle at sorcery speed. Next is the cycling mechanic. This is a mechanic that lets you discard the card and draw a card instead of casting it normally. So Sky Crash, you can spend 2 mana to kill an artifact, or you can cycle it for a red mana, which means you just discard it and then draw a new card. Next is the Start Your Engines mechanic, which introduces the concept of speed. So when you play a card that says Start Your Engines, if you have no speed, then you get some speed and it starts at 1, and then it increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and the max speed that you can get is 4. So if you play a card like Streaking Oil Gorger, you will have a speed of 1, and then if you hit your opponent or they lose life for some other way, your speed will go up to 2, and then eventually it will get to a max speed of 4 if your opponent continues to lose life on your turns. And then you get some benefits when you have max speed. So in the case of Streaking Oil Gorger, it will gain lifelink. The final mechanic is Exhaust, which is an activated ability that you can activate once on the cards that have it. So Skystreak Engineer is a 2 mana 1/3 flyer, but once per game you can spend 5 mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the Skystreak Engineer. Moving on to the top commons and kicking things off with white. At number 1 is Leonin Surveyor. This 2-drop is just what you're looking for in your decks. It has Start Your Engines, so you'll be able to start building up your speed nice and early in the game. You also are going to have First Strike on your turns with the creature, which means it's going to attack quite well. And then in the late game, you can hopefully be able to exile it from your graveyard to draw a card, because by that point, hopefully you'll have built up to max speed, which means you get some card advantage and some early aggression and stats, which is just what you're looking for in your 2-drops. And number 2 is Lotus Guard Disciple. This is a really nice creature because it has, first of all, evasion, which is going to help you attack in and make sure that you build up your speed early in the game by hopefully your opponent not having any blockers for it, but also lets you facilitate a big life total swing by giving a creature lifelink and indestructible until end of turn when it comes into play, which can not only enable attacks with the indestructible, but also help you win in racing situations. At number 3 is Ride's End, which is just a nice removal spell to have access to. The fact that you get to cast it for a discount in many situations, especially when your opponent is trying to attack you early and build up their speed, is really, really nice. And the fact that you always have that fail case of casting it for 5 mana is great as well. So Ride's End coming in at number 3. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Flood the Engine. This is just a nice removal spell to have access to. You can deal with problematic creatures or vehicles by tapping them and making them lose all of their abilities, and they do not untap. So for 3 mana, that's pretty solid removal to have access to. At number 2 is Nimble Thopterist. For 4 mana, you get 2 bodies, which have a total of 4/3 worth of stats, but one of them is an Evasive Thopter, which can peck in for damage, help you build up your speed when you care about that, or just trade with your opponent's 1 toughness creatures, or potentially crew your vehicles. So just having 2 bodies is really nice, and the stats, having some of them in the air is also good as well. And then Gearseeker Serpent coming in at number 3. There are quite a few artifacts in this set, especially if you build around it a little bit, and so you can oftentimes get a huge creature for relatively cheap, and the fact that it can't be blocked in the later stages of the game when you just need to hit them once or twice more to win is also quite terrifying. So Gearseeker Serpent is a nice card to have in your blue decks. Next up is black. At number 1 is Spin Out. Very straightforward, 3 mana to destroy a creature or vehicle. It's really nice to have access to this sort of catch-all removal spell that can take out whatever your opponent plays. Even if it's an expensive card, has a lot of toughness or things like that, you can just take it out for a good clean 3 mana. And number 2 is Grim Bauble. It's cheap and it can kill creatures that are sometimes a little bit more expensive than the Grim Bauble itself. So you get to kill your opponent's 2-drops or sometimes even their 3-drops for just 1 mana, and then you can also sacrifice it to Surveil 2, or just leave it in play for some artifact synergies that you may have. So Grim Bauble is a really nice card to have access to make sure you don't fall behind in the early turns, or that you can kill your opponent's blockers while also deploying other threats in an aggressive strategy. And then Deathless Pilot is a really nice card to have access to at the 2-drop slot, because in the early turns you really don't care if it trades off, and then it comes back for a relatively cheap amount of mana, 4 mana back to your hand. So in the late stages of the game where you have plenty of mana, you can just bring this back into your hand and play it immediately again, use it for some endless chump blocking, or just make sure that you'll always be able to crew your vehicles because you have this Deathless Pilot that not only crews vehicles very well, but also is very hard to get rid of permanently. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Lightning Strike. 2 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, instant speed, just what you are looking for, and it can even target your opponents, so if you get them low enough, Lightning Strike can definitely win you some games off the top of your deck if you are in those situations. Just a really nice straightforward card that you're going to be happy to have. At number 2 is Crash and Burn. For 4 mana, you can kill basically anything that you care about at instant speed. It's relatively easy to cast with just a single red pip, and the fact that it can even just kill vehicles if they aren't crewed is also quite nice. So you hold up your mana, your opponent either decides to crew their vehicle or doesn't, but you'll always have the option to kill it. So Crash and Burn is quite nice. And then at number 3 is Burner Rocket. This card just really helps you facilitate building up your speed in the early stages of the game, because you can just always be attacking with your creatures, and if your opponent does block, you can flash in your Burner Rocket, give it +2/+0 and trample, hopefully trade with a bigger creature that your opponent has, and trample over for a little bit of damage to continue building up your speed. And then you have a nice little 3/1 vehicle that's easy to crew and can keep the attacking rolling. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Run Over, a really nice efficient instant speed removal spell for green that can sometimes even be cast for 1 mana, and you're just going to be able to take down your opponent's creatures. Green doesn't always get great removal, so having access to this is really nice. And number 2 is Pothole Mole, a nice 3-drop creature that gets you some card advantage right away by getting you a land from your graveyard back to your hand in most cases, and if your deck does care about the graveyard a little bit, you can get some synergies there as well. And number 3 is Migrating Ketradon. It's an expensive top-end card, but it gets you everything you need to help stabilize. You gain 4 life, which is a huge chunk of life, and it has reach, so even your opponent's evasive creatures won't be able to punch through. And the addition of cycling means that even in the early turns when you can't cast your 6-drops, the Migrating Ketradon is not going to be a completely dead card in your hand, which is just what you're looking for. Next up is the Archetype overviews, and we're kicking things off with Red-White, which is a deck that cares about having lots of vehicles and being aggressive. Cloudspire Coordinator is perfect for this deck. It comes into play, helps you set up your draw with the Scry 2, and then you get to make pilots whenever you are having vehicles and mounts come into play. Cloudspire Sky Cycle is a really nice curve topper for this type of deck. If you can go 2-drop, 3-drop Cloudspire Sky Cycle, you're going to be able to get a lot of power and toughness distributed among your creatures thanks to those +1/+1 counters, and it's an evasive vehicle that is easy to crew. And then Canyon Vaulter is just the sort of 2-drop you want in this deck that makes your mounts, or especially your vehicles in this deck, a lot better by giving them flying. And you'll also be looking for a card like Reckless Velocitor, which is a nice top-end card that makes your vehicles or mounts, but mostly in this deck vehicles, bigger and stronger by giving them +2/+0 and trample. So that's a really nice card to have access to as well. Next up is Blue-Black, which is a deck that cares about gumming up the board and then plinking away at your opponent's life total as you control the game. So Haunt the Network is a really good card for this strategy, because if you have been able to get into that kind of board stall situation, you're going to be able to play your Haunt the Network, gain a little bit of life, drain your opponent for a little bit of life, and then have a couple of Thopters that are going to be able to plink away at your opponent's life total, which is just what you want to do. It's not the card that's going to get you to the stabilization situation on its own, but it's the sort of card that, as you're turning the corner, really helps put the nail in the coffin for your opponent. Haunted Hellride is also a really good card in this deck because you're trying to get into these board stall situations, and Haunted Hellride lets you turn even your small creatures into creatures that can punch through any board stall, thanks to the fact that whenever you attack, target creature gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn, and can even untap that creature so that it can continue to play defense if need be. Then Sabotage Strategist is a nice card for this deck because you want to be gumming up the board, and by giving all of your opponent's creatures -1, -0, that's going to make it much harder for your opponents to attack. And then once you're in that late game situation, you're going to have a big flying vigilance creature that's going to be able to end the game. And you also gain access to a card like Pact Doll Terror. Maybe you don't have your Haunt the Network and you want to just be building up your life total while slowly draining your opponent out, and Pact Doll Terror can definitely get the job done. It's even a great combo with Haunt the Network because you have Pact Doll Terror in play, Haunt the Network, all of a sudden you're getting a ton of triggers draining your opponent for a lot of life. Next is a green-white, which is a deck that cares about mounts and vehicles, but a lot of the time mounts are very heavily found in these two colors. Lagoran, Soul of Alakria, is a critical 2-drop for this strategy. It's a nice little 2-drop to play early, and if you have other mounts in play that you can get, you can play Lagoran, crew it up with another mount, hopefully, and just start building up those counters really, really early in the game. It's very easy to saddle with a saddle cost of 1. You also gain access to a card like Unswerving Sloth, which is just a really nice mount that's going to be able to attack consistently, because when it attacks, it gains indestructible until end of turn, and can even untap the creatures that were being used to saddle it. So that's a really nice card to have access to as well. You also can gain access to a card like Cloudspire Captain, which just makes your mounts and vehicles bigger, and can even crew some of the bigger ones by itself. And finally, Veteran Beast Rider is a great 3-drop for this deck. Not only does it have good stats as a 3-mana 3/4, but it does untap your creatures at the beginning of your end step, so any of the creatures you were using to crew or saddle will untap, and you can also spend some mana to buff your creatures to make it harder for your opponents to block. Next is red-blue, which is a deck that cares about discarding cards for some benefit, and oftentimes that's going to be found in the cycling mechanic, but you also gain access to a card like Boosted Sloop, which can consistently draw you cards and discard cards, and because it has evasion with the menace, it's going to maybe be hard for your opponent to block anyway, and it's quite easy to crew. A card like Marauding Mako is the perfect payoff for this sort of card, because it will grow as you are discarding cards, whether that be from cycling or from a card like the Boosted Sloop, and it has cycling itself, so if you're in the late game and you've already kind of gone through all of your enablers, all of your cyclers are gone, you can just cycle the Marauding Mako away to look for what you need. There's also the Scrounging Skyray, which is a 2-mana version of that, but does have the benefit of evasion with flying, which means that it can really do some damage to your opponents if they don't have any evasive or flying blockers themselves. And then Broadside Barrage is just a great removal spell to have access to in this deck. 3-mana deal 5 is just very efficient, and you get to draw a card and discard a card to not only help you avoid flooding out and find just what you need, but also trigger your cards that care about the discarding effects. Next is black-green, which is a deck that cares about getting something big into your graveyard and then bringing it back into play to some degree, but can also just be a graveyard value deck. Broodheart Engine is a really good 2-drop for this deck, because it starts giving you some card selection and filling your graveyard early, and then you can spend 4 mana to sacrifice it and return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can hopefully get something huge into play ahead of schedule with the Broodheart Engine, something, for example, like Thundering Broodwagon, which is a 6-mana card that you are relatively happy to cast because it destroys a non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less, but if you are able to get it into the graveyard via either cycling it or by milling it over with a card like the Broodheart Engine, then you can hopefully bring it back into play for cheaper than 6 mana and really be happy with the result. Menace and Reach are nice as well. And then a card like Back on Track is also an extra piece of redundancy in this type of strategy, because you can return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield directly, and you even create a pilot as well. So if you have the Thundering Broodwagon in your graveyard, you can Back on Track, bring it back immediately, and even have something that can crew it. You also gain access to a card like Earth Rumbler, which uses your graveyard as well. So if you have a full graveyard with artifacts and creatures, you can be able to crew the Earth Rumbler very easily by simply exiling artifact or creature from your graveyard. And because it has Vigilance and Trample, then you are going to be able to keep it up on offense and on defense if need be, as long as your graveyard is well stocked, which hopefully you'll be doing in your black-green decks. Next up is white-blue, which is an artifact control deck. So you're trying to stall through the early turns of the game, get some artifacts into play to build up your synergies, and then go over the top of your opponents with card advantage and big artifacts. Guidelight Pathmaker is perfect for this deck because it's a big top-end artifact that you can play that gets you another artifact from your deck. And if it's a smaller artifact, then you can even put it directly into play. So if you need something to help you stabilize and you have a cheap artifact that can block, then Guidelight Pathmaker can go get that. And then because it has Vigilance, it can play offense and defense quite well once you get to that attacking stage of the game. Voyage Home is really nice for this deck. Draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, and because you're going to be playing a lot of artifacts in this strategy, you're going to be able to cast it for much less than the 7 mana advertised because of affinity for artifacts. So that's a great card to have access to in this strategy. And then something like Guidelight Synergist is really good as well, because in the early turns, it's going to be a 4 toughness blocker that hopefully stops your opponents from chipping in the air or some of their smaller ground creatures. But then once you're turning the corner and have a board state built up, you're going to be able to attack your opponent for a lot of damage. You're also going to gain access to a card like Spikeshell Harrier, which is really just good in general, but especially in this deck where you want to be able to slow the game down and especially stop your opponents from building up their speed too early. And because you're not going to be building up a lot of speed yourself, because you're going to be a more defensive late game deck, the Spikeshell Harrier is going to come into play, return a creature or vehicle an opponent controls to its owner's hand, and their speed will almost certainly be greater than your speed, so you'll be able to reduce their speed by 1 as well to hopefully take them off of max speed if they have it, And by that point, hopefully you'll be stabilized so they can't get it again easily. Next up is Red Green, which is a deck that cares about exhaust and using that in the middle to late stages of the game to finish off your opponents that you've hopefully gotten low with some early aggression. Boom Scholar is great in this deck as a 3-mana 3/3 that makes your other exhaust abilities cheaper to use and even has an exhaust ability itself to make it into a big creature and also give your creatures and vehicles trample until end of turn. So that's a nice one to have access to. Rocketeer Boost Buggy is a really scary early game card as a 2-mana 3/2 that can start building up treasures that can then help you snowball into either bigger threats or activating expensive exhaust abilities ahead of schedule. And you can even permanently turn it into a creature when the coast looks clear to be able to attack without having to crew it consistently, though with a crew cost of 1, it's easy to crew it anyway. Adrenaline Jockey is a good card for making sure your opponent is not messing with you on your turn, so if you are trying to activate your exhaust abilities and just spend a bunch of mana on your turn, your opponent is going to be punished if they're interacting with you during the phase of the game, that phase of the game, and you're also going to get a growing threat every time you use an exhaust ability. It gets a +1/+1 counter. Another excellent card for this deck is Elvish Refueler. This is a 3-mana 2/3 that lets you activate your exhaust abilities over and over. So as long as you haven't activated an exhaust ability this turn, you may activate exhaust abilities as though they haven't been activated, which gets around the one use only part of the exhaust. And it even has an exhaust ability yourself. So if you don't have anything better to do, you can just exhaust the Elvish Refueler every single turn to slowly grow those +1/+1 counters. But maybe you'll even have something better to be doing with your exhaust abilities. Next up is White Black, which is a max speed aggro deck that has the tools to grind into the mid and late game. Embalmed Descendant is the perfect 3-drop because it starts your engines, comes with a 2/2 buddy, so you get a 1/2 and a 2/2 for 3 mana, and if you get to max speed, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, which means that once your opponent is low because of all the aggression you've been putting on them early, you can close the game out by just attacking in with your creatures and having them die, and your opponent will slowly get plinked to death if you've been able to get them low enough. Nesting Bot is another great card in this deck because it comes in early and gets that speed going as early as turn 1. You start your engines, then on turn 2 you can start attacking and increasing that speed, and then if it dies, you even get another 1/1. So you can just keep sending it into combat. You can send it in along with another creature, and if the Nesting Bot does die because your opponent has a good block for it, you still get to keep some stats on the board. And then once you get to max speed, if the Nesting Bot is still around, it becomes a 2/1. Another nice card for this deck is Pride of the Road, because as a 4-mana 2/5, it's not the Vigilance, it's not the greatest creature on its own, but if you do have max speed enabled, which this deck is trying to do very quickly, then you're going to be able to give a creature or vehicle you control double strike, which is absolutely devastating. Even on something like a 3/3, turning it into a double strike creature makes it very hard to block, makes sure it trades, and overall is a really scary ability to have. So Pride of the Road is a nice little payoff for this deck if you're able to get your max speed early in the game. And then Dune Drifter is a nice value card to make sure you're still going to be fine in the mid to late game. You can buy back your key cards. Maybe you have a card that has a max speed ability that had the trade-off early in the game and you want to bring it back so you'll still have access to it later now that you actually have max speed. So maybe you have your Embalmed Ascendant that you played early in the game and it traded off or it died, and then you play your Dune Drifter later in the game, and now that you have max speed, the Embalmed Ascendant is even better. So that's a really nice little thing to be aware of in this deck, is that Dune Drifter gives you some nice access to your max speed cards, even if they've traded off early in the game. And then, of course, as a vehicle, it can trade with things itself and do some good work as well. So you can return back your other creatures from the graveyard directly into play. Next is Blue-Green, which is a deck that cares about ramping up and paying exhaust costs that are maybe a little bit expensive thanks to that ramp ability. So Ranger's Aether Hive is really, really nice. It's a 3-mana 3/5 Vigilance vehicle with Crew 1, so it's really easy to throw any of your creatures into this and have a giant blocker as early as turn 3. And whenever you activate an exhaust ability, you create a Thopter, so you're going to be able to start building up your aerial army and chipping in the skies, and it's also really convenient that those Thopters can crew the Ranger's Aether Hive. Sky's Serpent Seeker is another really good card for this deck. As a 2-mana 1/1 flyer with Death Touch, it's going to be able to trade for whatever your opponents have and also chip in the skies if you need it to. And then because of its exhaust ability, it's going to be able to ramp you up and even get a +1/+1 counter thanks to its exhaust ability. Ranger's Refueler is a great card in this deck because whenever you activate an exhaust ability, you're going to draw a card, which will keep the cards flowing. It even has an exhaust ability itself to be able to make it into an artifact creature permanently, though you're hopefully going going to be able to activate better exhaust abilities on your other cards before you have to use that one, because making it into a creature permanently does make it a little bit more vulnerable to removal. You'll also gain access to a common like Hazard of the Dunes, which is just a really solid creature, 4 mana, 4/4 trample reach, and it has that expensive exhaust ability that your deck is going to be uniquely positioned to use because you're going to have a little bit more ramp than other decks. You're trying to get to these late game scenarios to use these exhaust abilities, and putting those 3 counters onto it is going to make it into a formidable threat and hopefully trigger some of your exhaust payoff cards as well. Finally, we have Black-Red, which is a max speed aggro deck that's trying to get that speed up to max as quickly as possible and then destroy your opponent with the benefits you get from that before they're able to stabilize. Gastel Thrillseeker is absolutely fantastic in this strategy. It's a 2 mana 2/3, so already good stats. It starts your engines on turn 2, and when it enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you gain 1 life. So you're immediately going to take your speed up to 2 if you play Gastel Thrillseeker on turn 2, because your speed starts at 1, and then you're dealing a damage to your opponent, which is fantastic. And then once you get to max speed, it has Death Touch and Haste, so it stays a relevant creature. Apocalypse Runner is a huge vehicle for 4 mana. It's a 6/5 creature if you are able to crew it and attack with it, and importantly, it can activate as soon as it comes into play to give a creature you control with power 2 or less lifelink, and most importantly, unblockable until the end of the turn. So you're going to be able to keep chipping in with your creatures and even gain some life, but most importantly, keep dealing damage to your opponent so you can build up towards max speed. And then Rising Necrogent, especially if you're able to have max speed as soon as it comes down on turn 5, just starts building you an army very quickly. Your opponent has to deal with this card or it's going to snowball out of control. And as a 5 mana 5/4, even if you don't quite have max speed yet, at least it has some reasonable stats. There's also other payoffs like Endrider Spike Spitter, which gets you a constant stream of cards once you are able to get to max speed, because at the beginning of your upkeep, you'll exile the top card of your library and you can play that card this turn. So that's another nice little payoff that'll keep the cards flowing in your aggressive deck as you seek to finish off your opponent. Moving on to some common combat tricks to be aware of. White has Light Shield Parry to give +2/+2 for 1 mana. Blue has Howlers is Heavy, which can be cycled to give a creature -3/-0 until end of turn. Black has Maximum Overdrive for 2 mana to give +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and Indestructible until end of turn. Red has Burner Rocket for 2 mana, as we already discussed, to give +2/+0 and Trample. Red has Pedal to the Metal, which can boost a creature by a lot in the late game, and even by a little in the early turns to help win a combat with +X/+0 and First Strike. Green has Silken Strength, which can give +1/+2 and Reach, and untap the creature, which is important to note if your opponent is attacking and then trying to use it on blocks. And then also has Bestow Greatness for +4/+4 and Trample until end of turn. Trample, of course, especially relevant when you're trying to build up your speed, because even trampling over for a single point of damage will help build up your speed. Next are some traps to be aware of. Ancient Vendetta is just a 4 mana do nothing in so many cases that you really shouldn't be playing this card if you want to maximize your chances of winning. Even if your opponent has a really good card in their deck, you're going to be putting yourself at a disadvantage by spending 4 mana just to try and take that card out of their deck. They just might not draw it in that game, and that's probably what you're going to be better off hoping for in those cases. Next is Racer's Scoreboard. For 4 mana, you can just do better than draw 2 and discard a card, and by the time you get to max speed, you really don't generally care about the cost reduction on your spells. Then at number 3 is Spell Pierce. This is a card you can play, but because it is a card that is so commonly played in constructed formats, it's easy to misevaluate it and thinks it's an all-star in limited, when in reality it's a card that you're oftentimes not going to even want to play at all, though in a pinch you can put it into your deck. Next are some combos you can assemble with just commons and uncommons. First up is the combo between Detention Chariot and Tune-Up. So for 1 mana, you can cycle the Detention Chariot, and then for 4 mana, you play your Tune-Up, return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. If it's a vehicle, it becomes an artifact creature, so Detention Chariot becomes a 6/6 creature that you got for just 4 mana, and you even get the Detention Chariot's Enter the Battlefield effect to exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls. Next is the combo between Greenbelt Guardian and Maximum Overdrive. Greenbelt Guardian can give creatures Trample, Maximum Overdrive can give something Death Touch, and the combination of Death Touch and Trample means that you only have to assign a single point of damage to the opposing creature before trampling over for the rest. So that's the potential synergy you need to be looking for if you're in a situation where you can maybe end the game on the spot by having your big creature not only win the combat, but also trample over and deal those final points of damage. Just nice to be aware of those sorts of things. Next is the combo between Grim Bauble and Hellish Sideswipe. So Grim Bauble, as we established, comes into play, kills one of your opponent's small creatures, but it does leave an artifact in play if you do not choose to sacrifice it. Hellish Sideswipe lets you sacrifice an artifact or creature for value by letting you get a hyper-efficient removal spell by sacrificing one of them, and so Grim Bauble is the perfect card to sacrifice to it. You can also use Grim Bauble plus Trade the Helm to give your opponent the Grim Bauble, and then in return you get one of their creatures or artifacts, which is fantastic, especially because your opponent might not be playing a black deck, so might not be able to use the Bauble at all. And then finally, the combo between Push the Limit and cards like Clamorous Ironclad is really, really cool. If you have Push the Limit and you have a bunch of cyclers like the Ironclad, you can just cycle a bunch of Ironclads into your graveyard and then play Push the Limit and bring back a bunch of them in one turn. There are some really cool redundant pieces for this. So instead of the Ironclad, you could have a card like Chitin Gravestalker. You could also have Skybox Fairy, a card like Migrating Ketrodon. It doesn't even matter if the card is in your colors as long as it has a colorless cycling ability, because if you can just fill your graveyard and then play Push the Limit, which you're digging towards as you cycle your cards, it's just a really cool little combo that you can try to assemble. Moving on to the common mana fixing, first up is the gain lands. There's 10 of them, cards like Wind Scarred Crag that come into play, gain you a life, and can tap for one of two colors. Those will replace the basic lands in your pack 50% of the time. There's also Night Market, which can choose any color as it comes into play and then tap for that color, which is really great mana fixing, and also it has cycling, so in the late game when you don't need lands, you can just cycle it away and hopefully draw a spell, which is fantastic. Starting Column is reasonable fixing as well if you need it. 3 mana comes into play and can add mana of any color, and then once you do get to max speed, hopefully you can sacrifice it to draw 2 cards and then discard a card, so get a little bit of a card rebate once you no longer need the Starting Column. Velo Heart Bike in green is also some fixing you'll have access to, comes into play, gains you a little bit of life, can tap to add mana of any color, and then even has a reasonably low crew cost, so you can either get some mana or have a reasonable creature if you are able to crew it instead. Moving on to some final tips. First up, be on the lookout for ways to up your speed in a potential board stall. It is reasonable to expect that your opponent is going to try to stop you from getting to max speed, and so you're going to sometimes need the ability to deal damage to your opponent or have them lose life in a way that gets around conventional blocking. So that could include things like evasive creatures, ways to give your creatures unblockable, or even just direct damage effects that are going to deal your opponent a point of damage to help you continue to build up that towards max speed. Also, combat tricks are very helpful for enabling max speed because your opponent is going to want to block you. They are in a position where if they don't block you, you get a tangible benefit. So you really get to leverage those combat tricks because your opponent's going to tap out for a blocker, you're going to ascend in with your creature, and your opponent is going to feel forced to block to try and stop you from gaining speed, which makes combat tricks a little bit better as well. And then the final tip is vehicles and mounts make instant speed interaction better because of the additional tapping. So unlike a sorcery speed removal spell, if your opponent is going to invest tapping their other creatures in order to crew a vehicle on their turn or saddle up a mount, if you then have an instant speed removal effect, you can kill your opponent's creature after they have spent some other resources in order to make it into a creature. So they tap a creature to crew up their vehicle, they tap a creature to saddle up their creature, you kill it after it's saddled or crewed. All of a sudden, your kill spell got an additional tap added onto it, which makes instant speed interaction even better in this format than it would normally be. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did make it to the end, remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag Aetherdrafter in the comments section down below. That's going to do it for this one. I hope to see you on the racetrack battling in Aetherdrift, and I'll talk to you next time.